Guys, to our witnesses for the late start. Lots of votes today, so apologies to everyone around. So pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the study of the Canadian government's countries of focus for bilateral development assistance. Colleagues, today we have World Vision Canada, CARE Canada, and UNICEF Canada. I would ask to start from left to right, or my left, your right, and just go and, for the record, give your name and title, and then we'll start with the presentations. Great. Start with Carleen.
Good afternoon. My name is Carleen McGinty. I'm with UNICEF Canada. I'm our Deputy Director of International Policy and Programs.
Good morning. Good afternoon. My name is Santiago Alba. I'm with CARE Canada. I'm the Senior Director of International Development.
Good afternoon. Sean MacArthur with CARE Canada, Advocacy and Government Relations Advisor.
Good afternoon. Jamie McIntosh, Vice President of Programs and Policy with World Vision Canada.
Good afternoon. I'm Rachel Logal-Carmichael. I'm a team leader for the International Programs team.
Okay, thank you. And I understand that World Vision Canada will start first. Jamie?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. Bon après-midi. Je désire tout d'abord.
Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank the committee for inviting us to appear before you today. World Vision is a child-focused Christian relief, development, and advocacy organization. We work with children in nearly 100 countries around the world.
Places actively supporting and empowering communities to take control of their own futures by overcoming poverty, injustice, and fragility. We're pleased to share our thoughts on the committee study on countries of focus for Canada's bilateral development assistance. We understand there are a number of issues that the committee is looking to address during the course of this study. For our time this afternoon, we'd like to focus on how Canada's international assistance framework can effectively address the circumstances facing the least developed countries. Let me start with an evident acknowledgement. The world is rapidly changing. Conflict, violence, inequalities, climate change, and the mass displacement of people have changed the way that we look at poverty and development and challenge us to find new ways of working. The UN Refugee Agency states that globally 1 in every 122 humans is now either a refugee, internally displaced, or seeking asylum. If this were the population of a country, it would be the world's 24th largest. It's realities like this that strengthen our resolve to collectively envision and work with urgency toward a new reality. One where poverty, hunger, and preventable deaths are eradicated, a world in which no one is left behind. But what will it take to get there? We must adapt our approaches and make them fit for purpose. World Vision itself is in the process of evolving our own efforts and our own approaches. We are increasingly working in fragile contexts, building resilience and sustainability, empowering citizens to hold their governments accountable, investing in innovative partnerships. We know that there is immense opportunity before us. In order to take advantage of these opportunities, we believe Canada can review its international assistance and design a framework that is focused on the poorest and most vulnerable in the world's toughest places, and that responds to evolving contexts by defining adaptable approaches. These principles have implications both on where and how we must focus our efforts, which I would like to unpack for you this afternoon. Canada is a country known for upholding human rights and empowering the most disadvantaged around the world. While we've seen tremendous progress with the Millennium Development Goals, the impact has been uneven between and even within countries. We need then to ask who has been left behind, where are they, and how do we reach them? Let's start first with who has been left behind. They are the unregistered, children who are not officially acknowledged at birth, the missed, mothers and newborns who die in childbirth, the isolated, Indigenous children and ethnic minorities living in remote rural areas and urban slums. They are the untraced, child laborers and trafficked children, the neglected, orphaned and homeless ones, the unclaimed, refugees, the stateless, and internally displaced. Most fundamentally, they are women and girls. And it is critical that we identify these individuals and keep them front and center as we walk through these specific considerations. Now that we've identified who these individuals are, let's focus on where we might find them. The majority of these individuals are in places where the burden of instability, poverty, hunger, and mortality are the highest, and yet where the biggest gains are to be made, in fragile contexts and where pockets of fragility exist. These are the places where there is conflict and violence, widespread violations of human rights, limited access to justice and rule of law, where there is economic instability and a lower capacity to adapt to shocks and stress, and where the government may be unwilling or unable to meet the needs of all or some of its residents. In the next decade, some of the world's most acutely vulnerable people will be living in fragile and conflict-affected cities and states, while we may think of traditional places like Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Somalia. They also include places like Mali, Honduras, and Nepal. For example, while Honduras and El Salvador are not traditionally known as fragile, but where violence in urban settings has an adverse effect on the society and its development, including things such as youth employment. In World Vision's Community Development Program, we're addressing the root causes of violence through investing in rehabilitation, diversion, and skills training initiatives with youth in or affected by gang violence. Our experience in such fragile contexts has shown us that significant progress is possible, so our focus should be where the risks are higher, but the potential gains greater. This brings us to recommendations of how Canada's international assistance should be designed to best reach these and of the most poorest and vulnerable in these contexts. In order to effectively undertake the exercise of country prioritization, we recommend that Canada not only look at countries as a whole, but recognize that pockets of vulnerability exist within countries and across regions. This should be done in coordination, of course, with the international donor community. Let's illustrate with the examples of Jordan and Lebanon. Jordan has been prioritized for development and humanitarian support, largely as a result of their alignment to donor values, legitimacy of government, and relative stability as compared to others in the region. Canada's bilateral support to Jordan has been highly influential in ensuring effective policy development to support the growing number of refugees, including supporting refugee ability to enter the labor market and for the education sector to accommodate Syrian children. Lebanon, on the other hand, is potentially on the brink of significant escalation of conflict that will destabilize the entire region even further. Due in part to poor governance and limited bilateral investment, Lebanon has been unable to effectively manage the significant influx of refugees. While priority countries have allowed for predictability of support and reduced aid fragmentation, there needs to be a mechanism in place that allows for the nimble shifting of resources regionally, as the burden of other countries can often overwhelm priority countries. Additionally, we recommend that once the country prioritization has been determined, that an adaptive approach to bilateral development assistance is put in place. This is to ensure that country strategies and programs are responsive to who the most vulnerable populations are, where they may be, recognizing the kaleidoscopic evolving context that we've described here today. One of the challenges with the current approach to funding of the government's bilateral development programs is that it does not enable partners to use funding to adapt to changes in rapidly evolving contexts. For example, the way that World Vision's own community development program model addresses this challenge is to immediately allocate 20% of private development funding to prevention and response. Repurposing such funds allows us to address emerging situations, as was the case of an unfolding food crisis in the Sahel in 2012, or currently in Southern Africa with the impact of El Nino. What would be most effective at an institutional level is an approach that sees improved cross-departmental collaboration and analysis, working together with national governments, regional bodies, and Canadian civil society to effectively respond to and prioritize these changing situations. And multi-year strategic efforts like block grants that allow for community-led response to fluid contexts. Such measures allow us to protect development gains, bridge the relief-development divide, and transition emergency responses to recovery as soon as it is appropriate and possible. In closing, we see a clear opportunity for the government to direct its focus based on these principles to ensure that we reach the unregistered, the missed, the isolated, the untraced, the neglected, the unclaimed, especially women and girls, those who are the poorest and most vulnerable in the world's toughest places. Thank you for inviting us to be here today and for including our perspective, our field-informed perspective in this important study. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. McIntosh. Now we'll go, I think, to Mr. MacArthur and Mr. Alba-Corral.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Care Canada is pleased to appear before this committee. Your study on countries of focus and thematic priorities for Canada's bilateral development assistance is timely for a number of reasons. 7 years ago has passed since the government of Canada selected its first 20 countries in 2009, and the list underwent a number of changes. In 2014, it was expanded to include 25 countries. In 2015, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction articulated a new plan to help communities and recover from disasters. Months later, a new global framework for international development was adopted in the form of the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. Last December, the Paris Agreement promised to help developing countries adapt to the effects of climate change. Amid these changes, the geography of poverty has continued to shift. Inequality within nations has risen. Erratic weather patterns have grown more frequently and severe, and crises have grown more numerous and protracted. Today, as Canada sets out to review its international development policy and funding framework, the time is right to reevaluate the countries of focus approach. Prompted by some of the trends just listed, CARE itself recently undertook a review of our own strategy for eliminating poverty and social injustice around the world. Much like the government of Canada, we were motivated to focus our resources, capacities, and experience for maximum impact. For CARE, the process began with an understanding that poverty is caused by unequal power relations. 1.2 billion people living in extreme poverty, and majority of them are women and girls. Addressing gender inequality is therefore critical for making significant impact on poverty. We also see one of the greatest inequality of our time reflected in the causes and consequences of climate change. The world's poorest and most vulnerable are the least responsible for causing the climate change. Yet they continue to bear the brunt of its impact. Building on this analysis, CARE prioritized 3 ways of addressing the underlying causes of poverty and social injustice: strengthening gender equality and women's voice, promoting inclusive governance, and increasing resilience to climate change, conflict, and disasters. We committed to 4 specific outcomes by 2020. 20 million people affected by humanitarian crisis will receive life-saving humanitarian assistance. 100 million women and girls will exercise their rights to sexual, reproductive, and maternal health and a life free from violence. 50 million poor and vulnerable people will increase their food and nutrition security and their resilience to climate change. And 30 million women will have greater access to and control over economic resources. These outcome areas share many similarities with the thematic priorities that have guided the Government of Canada's international development efforts in last years. And we are pleased that the themes being prioritized by the present government largely build upon Canada's strength in these areas. Determining where to concentrate one's efforts to achieve the greatest impact is another exercise which CARE has recently experienced. In 2015, we undertook to generate an index for development and humanitarian need. This required that we develop a set of criteria to determine where needs were greatest with respect to each of our thematic priorities: percentage or overall number of people living on the poverty line, prevalence of maternal mortality, women's economic inclusion, and so on. Our analysis also took key global indexes and reports into account, such as the Gini Inequality Index, Global Climate Change Adaptation Index, the Gender Development Index, or Index for Risk Management. Finally, we consider future needs and risks, including vulnerability of a country or a region to climate change, the projected conflict risk, the projected number of people below the poverty line by 2030, etc., etc. The end result was a tabulation of countries with the greatest needs categorized under each of the thematic priorities defined in our own program strategy. For instance, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zambia, or Madagascar topped the list under overall poverty and inequality, while Pakistan, Afghanistan, or Yemen topped the list of countries in need of assistance in areas such as women's economic empowerment. Many countries, of course, were found in need in several areas. But critically, our analysis showed that not all development needs are created equal in all countries. Some communities are best assisted through a combination of civil society and institutional capacity building. Others stand to benefit most from measures to strengthen women's access to safe or dignified jobs. Yet others are better suited to receive support targeting women's access to nutrition food. The Government of Canada today faces a unique opportunity to undertake a similar analysis, to ensure its international assistance is tailored to address the right issues, the right communities for the greatest possible impact. Care Canada is pleased to present 5 recommendations to help guide this process. First, the government should undertake an evaluation of Canada's country of focus approach. This should include an assessment of what has worked or not since the approach was first adopted in 2009. Has a focus on selected countries truly enhanced the impact and efficiency of Canada's development assistance? Has it improved development outcomes for women and girls in those communities? Second, the government should ensure that its focus on helping the poorest and most vulnerable people defines how, where, and what type of assistance is delivered. Need, in other words, should not be defined by a country's status as a least developing country. According to the World Bank, 73% of the world's poor live in middle-income countries. People, not countries, should be the targets of Canadian assistance. In CARE's experience, inequality is the lens through which these people are best identified and assisted. Third, if a country of focus approach is retained, the government should be held to account for those commitments. This means developing long-term, 10, 15 years, strategies for each country in consultation with implementing partners. This should be linked to broader regional strategies and attached to transparent and predictable funding envelopes. They should also underpin by robust monitoring and evaluation systems and subject to regular reviews. They should be flexible enough to accommodate changing conditions, but rigid enough to follow through on complex change. They should include mechanisms to support emergency preparedness in countries prone to natural disasters or conflict, and to redirect resources when disasters strikes. Fourth, Canada's new international assistance framework should include a mechanism for regular impact monitoring. The broad range of indicators attached to the Sustainable Development Goals provide a ready means to help Canada measure their impact, while ensuring alignment with global objectives. Finally, international development assistance must always be motivated by the interests of the people it aims to serve. The amalgamation of Canada's foreign affairs, international trade, and international development departments creates the conditions for more coherent and efficient engagement in the world. Trade and diplomacy can do much to leverage Canadian advantage and support international development objectives. However, international development itself is undermined if it's seen to support trade and diplomatic outcomes. With that, I thank you for your attention. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alba-Corral. And now we'll go to Carleen McGinty. Thank you.
Great. Honourable members of the committee, thank you so much for having me here today. As I mentioned before, I'm Carleen McGinty, the Deputy Director of International Policy and Programs at UNICEF Canada. Merci d'avoir invité UNICEF Canada pour être
Thank you for having invited UNICEF Canada to speak to you this afternoon to give you our perspective on the Canadian government's bilateral assistance and our recommendations for your study. I'm particularly going to focus on how the government can develop a new strategy. I would be happy to answer your questions in French, but most of my presentation will be in English.
Very briefly, UNICEF is the United Nations Children's Agency. We're active in 190 countries around the world, and UNICEF Canada was established 60 years ago. We work tirelessly in the areas of health, education, protection, emergencies, clean water, nutrition, and the list goes on. We've benefited from a very good and strong partnership with the Government of Canada, and I'm delighted to be here today to share our perspective with you. What I wanted to do before I got into my recommendations is I've just returned from Chad. I returned Friday afternoon. I spent a week there, and I want to give you a little bit of a perspective of what I saw, and it'll help inform some of our discussion. So Chad is a fragile state. It is not a country of focus for Canada. It is a member of the Francophonie. It is at almost the very bottom of the Human Development Index. It's at number 184 out of 187. It is completely surrounded by fragile states. It's surrounded by Libya, Sudan, Central African Republic, Nigeria, to name a few. And it is in a very precarious situation. It also has one of the highest mortality rates for children under 5 in the world. It says the third highest, has low immunization rates, child marriage is an issue. The list goes on and on. This is one of the toughest places in the world to be a child and a woman. I went there to see a vaccination campaign against tetanus. This is a program that the Government of Canada is funding UNICEF Canada to do. We're there with partners, and despite there being very little infrastructure, we've been able to immunize hundreds and thousands of women against tetanus, which is a killer of their children. It actually kills newborns within a few days of birth if the umbilical cords were cut with unclean instruments. So we are able to vaccinate all these women, and the reason we're able to do that is because of, one, the support of the national government. So the government has committed to purchasing all vaccine for all immunizations. Secondly, we're working with a number of partners, Gavi, the World Health Organization, and local partners on the ground. But what's apparent is that they're also using local innovations. They're using solar-powered energy to actually make sure that these vaccines are cold. So they don't have a lot of resources, but they are using what they have, and that's the sun. So they're using solar-powered energy. What was apparent, I met some women who were being vaccinated in a very remote area of the country, thousands of kilometers away from the capital, is that yes, they were happy to be vaccinated, happy for the protection, but they kept telling me, but we have no water here. We have no schools here. Our children have to leave school so they can help me fetch the water, and the water we have isn't clean. So it's just to give you a sense of there are still a lot of very fundamental aspects that have not yet been addressed, and we need to continue working in some of these most underserved places and to continue to reach these children who are living in these hardest to reach places. And I think Canada is well positioned to do that. I want to start by saying that this is an exciting time for Canada to be reviewing its international development assistance. We're in 2016, it's the new era of international development. We have the 2030 agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals. We're now looking at a global agenda for the world. We have progress, we know where we want to go, we have 17 goals, and we can work together to achieve them. And I think Canada needs to use the Sustainable Development Goals and this agenda to drive our work and to measure progress. There are 169 targets. We don't have to measure ourselves against all of them, but we can select those where we'll have the most impact and use those to drive Canada's international development assistance and to show progress. I have to say that Canada really has to be commended for the work that you did, the government did, ahead of the signing of the 2030 agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, to ensure that children were part of these goals. Canada played a leadership role there, and I think we should be very proud of that. I want to make sure that children and youth are at the heart of Canada's international development assistance. They have to be at the heart of delivering the 2030 agenda, and they're the litmus test for the health and future well-being of all our societies. So currently, securing the future of children and youth is part of Canada's development strategy. That focus needs to continue. Children still suffer disproportionately from poverty. And if we invest in children, there's actually a very strong economic argument to do that. There are very strong economic and social returns. And children and young people are not passive recipients of aid. When we invest in their rights, they grow into the people that will change our world for the better. And also what UNICEF has realized through our own research is that if we actually reach the most disadvantaged children first, if we invest in the most disadvantaged children first, it has two key advantages. One, it allows us to be faster at making progress. And two, it's actually more cost effective than focusing on the easiest to reach children. Now it's about how Canada can't do it all. So how can we make Canada's aid work harder and work smarter? And the way we can do that is by actually focusing on the most underfunded areas of the Sustainable Development Goals. And those are the areas of health and nutrition for children, child protection, quality education, and early childhood development. Now, this isn't just the right thing to do. This is what economists are saying are the right thing to do. This is where you get the biggest bang for your buck. There's the Copenhagen Consensus. So this is 100 peer-reviewed analyses from the world's top economists and sectors, and they've identified 16 of the 169 targets of the SDGs as being the most effective investments. And 13 of those 19 are targets that are focused on children. I would encourage Canada to focus its efforts in these 13 targets. Furthermore, Canada, again, as I said, can't do it all. So where can we do it? Number one priority, focus on the most vulnerable people. Those are children and youth who are living in hard-to-reach areas, and they need our help. These include children who are living in humanitarian emergencies and who are living in fragile settings. We know that cycles of poverty are intergenerational, and they're perpetuated because of repeated and cumulative effects of crises. If we want to stop these, we need to invest in resilient development. Resilient development means providing children and communities with what they need to better prepare for shocks in the future, to better manage crises, and to recover from these more rapidly. Canada's already investing in some of these areas, and Canada should continue down that path. Second priority, make sure that we're supporting those gains that have been achieved. So a number of countries between 2015 and 2030 are going to move from a low income to a middle income status. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the government has the capacity to make that transition. So we need to continue investing in these countries, making sure we can help them sustain the gains that they've made. And lastly, we need to leave room for innovation. Canada's aid needs to remain flexible and nimble so we can invest in those game-changing investments for children. For example, clean energy. We know that if kids can have access to safe lighting at home, clean cook stoves, this will change their family's life. They'll be healthier, they'll be able to do their homework safely, girls won't be forced to go out and collect firewood and be exposed to exploitation. Lastly, Canada needs to play to its strengths. We have a comparative advantage in certain areas, including maternal newborn child health and sexual and reproductive health, as well as climate change. Canada needs to play to its strengths. In maternal newborn child health, we know that Canada is a leader in this area. We need Canada to continue to invest in sustaining these gains. There are still 11 children under the age of 5 who die every minute. We need Canada to remain focused there. We also need to make sure that children are healthy when they're protected from violence. We can't exclude the issue of violence. This is a new area in the Sustainable Development Goals. Canada has also been a leader. If Canada pulls out of this area, we risk losing the gains that were made. And in fact, this committee actually conducted a study on the issue of protection of children against violence in June, and I would encourage the committee to look at the recommendations that came out of that study. And climate change. Canada has invested heavily in climate change, and it's an exciting opportunity. It has a lot of benefits for children. We know that children are the ones who suffer disproportionately from climate change, and investments in clean energy will go a long way, and we're very encouraged by Canada's investments in this area. So that's where I'll leave it with you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much to UNICEF, Care Canada, and World Vision. And colleagues, we'll try and make up a little bit of time, but as you know, I'm not very good at that. So we'll probably end up being here a little longer than we normally are, and that's probably a good thing because we have a very good group of people before us. So I'll start right off the bat with Mr. Allison.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and to our witnesses, thank you once again for being back before us today. Ms. McGinty, I liked the comments you made in terms of, targeting our competitive advantage where we've done well. and how we've done that. And I noticed that, you know, you did talk about maternal and child health. And I guess my question is, when we look at this, you know, the study in terms of where do we focus, I mean, do we expand the list? Do we shorten the list? I mean, I agree that we should be looking at where we've done well or where we, you know, what Canada can offer as competitive advantage. But do you have any thoughts in terms of, should we be looking at a more thematic scheme then? Like, we should be looking at areas versus countries? And you know, obviously, you know, we talk about countries that, and I raised this question with the officials when they hear, was that, you know, you take a Vietnam who's now in a middle income country, it doesn't mean they need less help in terms of, so just your thoughts in terms of, is this an opportunity for us to expand the list, but also realizing that we don't have limited resources? You know, you talked about Gavi and we talked about the Global Fund, obviously great organizations that do other things to some of these very, very poor countries as well. So just your thoughts on, you know, how we focus or how what your suggestion to us would be.
Great. Thank you for the question, Mr. Allison. So firstly, at UNICEF, we're not advocating for a country-focused approach. We would support a thematic focus. And I think that, as I mentioned, areas where Canada already has a competitive advantage would go a long way in making Canada's aid work smarter for beneficiaries, but also for Canadians. In terms of the thematic focus areas, I really would encourage you all to look at the Copenhagen Consensus, which identifies 19 targets that really present the biggest impact in terms of a small investment. So I think that can really help guide your work. And as we've heard from everyone here on the panel, I think the lesson learned from the Millennium Development Goals is that we left a number of people behind. So the vision and the lens to use is to reaching those that are hardest to reach, to reaching the poorest of the poor, and they can be found everywhere. They're not just in low-income countries or middle-income countries, and you can use different approaches to that. So perhaps Canada's aid will be required more heavily in a low-income country, but you can rely on other partners or in building local capacity in other areas. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. UNICEF certainly uses different approaches, whether we look at the capacity of a government. Is the government low capacity or is it high capacity? And you work with them accordingly. But you have a formidable challenge ahead of you all, and those are some of my thoughts.
Thanks. I'm just going to ask one other question. I'm going to pass it over to Mr. Kent. But Mr. McIntosh, you also, you know, talked a bit about maybe, I think it was looking at more regional areas. So maybe, I guess, do you want to flesh that out a bit? Are you suggesting maybe it's maybe not countries of focus per se, but like Ms. McGinty said, maybe it's a regional focus and that we need to look at this issue. I know you were talking about migration and some of these other issues that you guys have been working on, but would you just expand on that just briefly?
Yeah, so I think the issue is really to look at the volatile nature of these situations. So it really is the case that whether one chooses to do a country prioritization or a thematic or sectoral, we need to have the highly adaptive ability to say, let's be more nimble. So in that, what we were advising is that there could be some regional reallocation as the context changes. So you could look at Ebola, you know, in the Ebola response, if we were prioritizing one country, but Ebola broke out in a different country, and we didn't rapidly respond, the cost, the social consequences, the cost in terms of lives saved or lives lost, you know, would certainly compound. So likewise, we might focus somewhere in Central America and then see what we saw Honduras having the highest homicide rate per capita in the region. Now that's being outstripped by the situation in in El Salvador. You know, having the ability to regionally reallocate is really what we're talking about, or even if we choose some sector, there might be an unknown risk that leaps up upon us. We should have the ability to be adaptive midstream.
Thank you very much. And I was impressed by the suggestion of 5 recommendations with regards to the reevaluation of countries of focus. My question bears on number 2 and number 4, focus on need, not LDC ranking, and impact monitoring. And I was taken by the update on your visit to Chad but also, and with previous witnesses, I've asked about 6 years after the Haiti earthquake and billions of dollars contributed by many countries. Canada is a lead among the stabilization countries. There's very little to show, part of it because of government inability to govern. But I'm wondering, does this come to a point of reallocation? What should Canadians be thinking about the development funds that we have been spending in Haiti and not spending in Chad? I mean, how do we rationalize potential reallocation?
There you go. Well, I think when we talk about evaluation, it's not only to say what we haven't done. I think it's also to see what we have learned, what we have done. And I think that's going to be the critical point, because I don't think that we can say Haiti was, even before the earthquake, already in a big, not really good situation. But the reality today is the mortality, infant mortality is much better than it was before the earthquake. So there's a lot of things that we have done. And I think the way that we transmit this to Canadians has to also to understand that we are not going to have always the same results in every place that we intervene. That there's going to be many aspects that are going to change the way that we measure that level of success. And on the other side, if we want to be the innovation agency that Canada has been since the beginning of development, innovation sometimes are going to bring that we learn from mistakes. And I think we see that from the private sector. Innovation comes from places where you invest and you don't get the major results. So I think it's a both message. Not everything, actually, I think development works. I think that's a message that we have to send to Canadians. Development has worked and keeps working, and we are learning to do it better. And I think Haiti will be a good example. And also understanding that we cannot spread very thin our resources to every single country, that we also need to be able to collaborate with other governments, with other donors in how we respond to some needs. One of the main issues in Haiti was that there was not always a very strong coordination in how the aid was made. And maybe that's a lesson, is what is the role that Canada wants to play on bringing actors together, on reinforcing some of the spaces where those decisions are taken with other donors.
Thank you. And I'm going to go to Mr. Sedu. We'll get back to this question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, panelists. You're doing the best job you can around the world where the help is needed, so I thank you for that. With my background, I need to know to get the best mileage out of my dollar. So the question is, what are Canada's comparative advantage in relation to international development assistance? In what countries and what sector is Canada most likely to be able to achieve best results from its development spending?
You want to jump?
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. So in terms of Canada's comparative advantage, I mean, we have a lot of strengths. Canada is a Commonwealth country. Canada is a country of the Francophonie. Canada is a Pacific nation. We're a member of the UN. There are a number of alliances and relationships that we have to draw upon. So that's one thing. Secondly, I believe that Canada has a comparative advantage in the area of child health, maternal health, newborn health, and now sexual and reproductive health. So I think that's something to note. And secondly is the area of climate change. I think that with the significant investments that Canada has made, we are really leading in this area, particularly with the commitment to supporting low-income countries with mitigation and adaptation and an investment to support clean energy. And also the area I want to highlight is the protection of children from violence. Canada's officials have spent a lot of time providing technical assistance, creating a draft strategy, investing in building a child protection system, just like we have a health system. Canada has been investing in creating a protection system to make sure that there are focal points for children if they are affected by violence, abuse, neglect. And if Canada pulls out of this area, we really risk losing that. Canada is a leader in this area, and I'd love to see Canada continue to invest in that.
One more small one. I'm pretty sure it goes to Mr. McIntosh. When it comes down to administration costs, there are times that Canadians have a question about the administration cost. How do you compare yourself with the other entities, other competitive entities, when it comes down to the administration costs? Where do you sit? You don't have to, if you don't have the numbers, you don't have to answer it, but I'm curious.
Yeah, certainly. Is in terms of World Vision Canada's administrative costs, we essentially endeavor to be at about an 80-20 ratio, so 80% of our resources going toward the programmatic activities, and 20% being utilized to ensure that we can reach Canadians with the message of need that's out there, advocate about our activities and the effective intervention strategies that we have. So I would say that we're independently audited. We get significantly high ratings in terms of independent folks who would rank us as well on those sorts of things. It's one of those things that as a child-focused organization, we want to ensure that we're delivering good value for dollar to these children, and we want to optimize the amount of dollars that are going into those to those contexts for programs that will impact child well-being, both in terms of actual on-the-ground community development activities and advocacy efforts that will help leverage national actors to do their duty-bearer responsibilities to ensure child well-being outcomes. But essentially, we've been tracking over the last 5 years at about an 80-20 ratio.
If I have time left, I'll share my time with Mr.
Thank you very much for coming here, all of you. Thank you for your commentary. Ms. McGinty, I had a quick question for you. Since you brought up Chad, I found it very intriguing because on the 2014 list of countries that we're helping, Mali's on the list and South Sudan is on the list, but Chad is not on the list. Then you brought up the fact about the Millennium Development Goals, which have now been changed into Sustainable Development Goals. So the MDG goals were that in 2015, poverty would be halved. The Sustainable Development Goal is that by 2030, poverty should be eliminated. So if we focus on two countries that are beside a third country, how is that going to resolve itself? What do you suggest?
Well, Canada can't be everywhere. It can't be in every country. There's no doubt. We have limited resources. So I think it's about making Canada's limited resources work harder and go farther. And what we've learned from the Millennium Development Goals and what UNICEF has learned from our own experience is that if you reach the hardest to reach children, so the most vulnerable children, those who are living in slums, those who are living in far remote rural areas, that makes you can reach your targets faster and it is more cost effective. So when I presented the example of Chad, I wanted to paint a picture of how progress is possible with few resources. So Chad is not a country of focus for Canada, but we're still able, with support from Global Affairs Canada, a small amount of money, with Canadians, with global partners like World Health Organization and Gavi, we're able to roll out a massive vaccination campaign. So progress is possible. It's about using your money smartly and about capitalizing on local capacity, national government capacity, and these multi-stakeholder partnerships. It's not about one country doing it all or one agency doing it all. It's about a number of partners at the table, the private sector, UN agencies, academics, NGO partners. You need everyone at the table working together in a concerted effort, and that's what the Sustainable Development Goals are all about.
One more time?
Yeah, good time.
Okay. Mr. McIntosh, a question for you. Mr. Albacarel highlighted some of the criteria that he uses to, or how his organization uses to determine the which countries of focus that they focus on. Can you kind of give us a highlight or some commentary on what kind of criteria you use, just to sort of give us an informed opinion of what maybe we should be looking for also?
Yes, I'm going to ask my colleague Rachel to enumerate a little bit of what we do there and illustrate a little bit of our approach that way.
So for World Vision, we support 100 countries, almost 100 countries globally, and it's important for us to look at a constant profiling of these countries to understand better the vulnerabilities and what types of challenges they're experiencing. Within that profiling then, where we look at a range of countries from the most fragile to countries that are looked at as emerging markets, we're also looking at a fragility index to see how we would rate fragility for the countries that have particular indicators. So to speak to your, to your question, when we're looking at some of these countries that we want to define issues of mortality, malnutrition, access to health care, and prevalence of infectious diseases, we're looking at if these exist within the country, higher levels of fragility and vulnerability that we need to address.
Thank you. Monsieur Aubin, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Aubin, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to each and every one of you for being there. Thank you for your expertise, and thank you for helping us understand what's really happening on the ground. I only have 6 minutes to talk to you today, so I will try to just give a summary of what I understood from your presentations, and then I'll ask you a general question, and hopefully you can discipline yourselves and split the time accordingly. Now, our study has to do with Canada's approach to countries of focus. None of you criticized that approach, but very subtly and very diplomatically, you demonstrated that there may be some gaps or some shortcomings with that approach. For example, World Vision talked a little bit about these pockets of extreme poverty where that can't be reached because they're not in a country of focus, for example. Or, for example, UNICEF spoke about a thematic approach as an alternative. And our minister and our prime minister have said that the 0.7% target was too ambitious. Now, it seems that in coming years, we will have the same international aid budget as before, and 80 or 90% of that budget will go to countries of focus. So my question is, if this is not the right focus, the right approach, or if we need some alternative approaches like regional focus or thematic focus, then how will we make that transition? Each one of your organizations talked about the fact that you need to plan in the long term. You can't just go to a country for 6 months and then leave. So how will we ensure that we can have a smooth transition to these objectives for these countries of focus? How will we make that transition if a transition does in fact need to be made?
Okay.
Je vais répondre en anglais. Okay, thank you. Well, I think you're right. I mean, we have not enough resources to go to every country, and we know that by fact that focusing resources normally has a bigger impact than long-term impact. I think the critical element is how we are going to balance, how the Canadian agencies are going to balance both focusing in order to not be changing priorities and being able to invest in long-term plans, going to those I mentioned, the 10 years, 15 years, because the kind of changes that we want to have are in many cases behavioral change, capacity of governments, infrastructure. We cannot be doing this in 4 years plans. So that's going to be one place. And on the other side, we are going to be able to create funding mechanisms with governments and agencies that also are flexible to respond to change. Example, a country that CARE is working with the government of Canada in many areas is Ethiopia. And we have a long plan working in Ethiopia around food security, nutrition, maternal health, microfinance, a very comprehensive approach in responding on 5, 6, 7 years response to in different areas. We have El Niño. We have several droughts, one after the other. We have to have mechanisms that certain of those funding that was planned in a very specific plan can also be allocated for some specific needs on a more humanitarian action that actually is going to build capacity and is going to build the resilience of those communities to be able to continue on their development path. So I think it's going to be not an easy journey, but it's going to be a journey of balance. The other piece is going to be, I think, World Vision was very clear, the regional approach. Most of the issues that we are facing today are regional. Most of the strategies and most of the agencies are developing are regional, Southern Africa, Sahel, Central America, because the issues are regional. And by focusing in one country, is not going to be always the right way. The other piece, I think, is going to be how we engage as Canadians with other donors and other governments in our plans, how we really have that discussion that actually is happening in many places today already on country, how we talk with the other development agencies to be sure that where the Canadians cannot go, the French can go. And I think that will be the three elements that we have to have in consideration to be able to achieve the goals that we want.
Sure. Thanks, Carly. Yes, I think that these are actually important considerations here, looking at sort of the ecosystem of what the international development community has to offer, different nations have to offer, and sort of trading off with one another to ensure that we have good coverage. Some of it is about the kind of interventions, the kind of development assistance that you transition to. So even with World Vision's own work, we're looking in certain contexts where maybe we started out with humanitarian provision of emergency supplies, we transitioned over to longer-term development. Some of those countries that are now nascent or emerging economies, we're actually able to transition instead of doing programmatic. We've done some system strengthening, and now we're moving to a monitoring and advocacy approach where local community actors are able to capture the gains to ensure that children's rights are protected, upheld, enforced. So that it's not it's maybe a light approach rather than a complete divestment. Staging this over time, but following that heat map of need and keeping the needs, I think Carly mentioned it best, we're looking at the needs of individual human beings caught in these situations wherever they may reside. That transition is going to be difficult. It's going to take learning. It's going to take a lot of dialogue and getting some of it wrong, but having the courage to say, we've got to do things differently, we've got to adapt, and we've got to do it more rapidly than we have been able to in times past.
Do I have a moment to? Okay, great. The one thing I would add to comments that have been made is the focus on resilient development. So if Canada will be moving out of certain countries, it will be important to ensure that that country has the capacity to withstand future shocks. So we know that there's climate change disasters, there's increasing political conflict, crises is more protracted, so we need to make sure that they have the capacity to withstand these shocks and to rebuild themselves more quickly. And the way that Canada's already been doing this and should continue to do this is to invest in system strengthening. So investing in the health system and investing in the protection system. If that system is in place, if it can go from the capital and have some sort of outpost that reaches the most remote areas, then we can ensure that communities have a chance and they do have a system they can count on. And that means that the government is working.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Miller, please.
Thank you. A number of you spoke directly or indirectly about climate change and how that's making your jobs more challenging, difficult, and requiring, you alluded to just a few seconds ago, requiring more flexibility. You think of the immediate impact that droughts have on immigration, conflict, access to food. I'd like you to touch at some length or just be able to develop on that theme and how Canada can best leverage its assets. Obviously, there's some cross-pollination between the Ministry of Environment, Foreign Affairs, and International Aid, and some of the challenges you see in your specific jobs in the near future. Thank you.
Okay, I'll take the first crack. So what UNICEF has seen is that children are the ones who are most affected by climate change, particularly those marginalized children. Their families don't have the capacity to withstand these shocks. So children who were already food insecure now no longer have access to food. It's too expensive or the crop has been wiped out. They might be displaced from their families. There's a number of issues that present themselves. You have more communicable diseases, more malaria, more diarrhea. So the impact on children is tremendous. What UNICEF thinks, what we've seen work well is one, to invest in disaster risk reduction. So for example, building disaster resilient schools. Making sure, for example, in Bangladesh with very low costs, with local materials, we're investing in an aquifer recharge system, which makes sure that in this coastal area where they're hit by cyclones, and now the cyclones are coming back more repeatedly, communities and these vulnerable communities didn't have access to potable water. the salt water kept contaminating it. But we have now this recharge system where they're able to keep that potable water despite cyclones coming, and they now have access to this regardless of what's happening in the country. So what we want Canada to do with its significant climate change investments is, one, make sure it reaches children. If you're going to be doing some major infrastructure projects, clean energy projects, make sure that children's rights are taken into account. Make sure that these big infrastructure projects or clean energy projects make a difference in children's lives. Children are not all living in major urban centers. Perhaps they're living in the slums, perhaps they're living in remote areas. Make sure that they have access to clean energy, safe sources of energy. And secondly, make sure that you are taking into account the risks that children face with some of these infrastructure projects, with clean energy projects. It can displace communities. Make sure that you take their rights into account. So those are some of the things that Canada could do, and I have a paper on that I'd be happy to share.
Yeah, if I can just quickly answer also, we actually had similar conversation as CARE International having discussion, and we became to what we call the super food systems. Superfood systems are systems that are sustainable, are productive, are equitable, and are resilient. And actually, that's what we're trying to do every intervention. One of the key elements on those, of course, is gender inequality. We know that the gender gap in agriculture and food production, it could bring us almost 50% more of the food that we produce today. We know that climate change is real for small farmers today. And also we know that the small farmers are feeding almost 70% of the population of the planet. So any intervention, any support that we do in that area has to target those elements of food. The other element is how food is used, the utilization component. We really know, and I think it's clear, that any program, any nutritional program has to target the first 1,000 days, it has to target the under 5. That is the area where we are going to have an impact that is going to go beyond the intervention, that is going to really cut the cycle of malnutrition, of poverty. And then working with civil society, how strengthening the capacity of civil society to be able to engage with markets, to engage on training and education with our extension services, because we cannot be supporting and strengthening the capacity of governments on the Ministry of Agriculture if we don't work at the same time strengthening the capacity of the civil society, or we will have, or we have in many African countries, kind of a division of where the knowledge is and where the needs happen. Those are some of the elements, and we are happy to share with you some of our super principles that we have already shared actually with the government of Canada.
I think one of the things that we endeavor to do at World Vision is to listen to the communities and see what ideas are being birthed in those contexts, and then try and take them and replicate them elsewhere. And so there are some interesting things that maybe could be considered for investment in, things like looking at replacing coal stoves with cook stoves. We have different opportunities to actually increase the health and livelihood of individuals in their context where you're addressing both the adverse impact of the pollutants that are being released, so finding new products that way. In one of our communities, they've worked on reforestation, where they've done reforestation in the past and then people just come in and steal the trees, or they harvest them prematurely. And what we've seen is one community has resorted to naming the trees after children in the community, and that's helped to create some level of enhancing ownership, stewardship, and keeping a benefit on focus on future generations. So there are some ways that communities are adapting in their own local contexts that we can try and help strengthen them. Another aspect could be looking at financing so that communities are resilient with crops that they harvest, that they're able to hold on to them for longer to get them to market in ways that will benefit them economically as well. So these are a few different aspects.
Thank you. That's the end of the first round, colleagues, and we'll go to the second round with Mr. Levitt.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentations. If the ultimate goal of Canadian international development is getting the money into the hands of the people or groups that need it most on the ground, there's many obstacles that can get in the way of that goal. Things like civil unrest and conflict in the countries of focus, state corruption, red tape at the NGO level, lack of strong local grassroots networks that can best affect getting the money into the right hands. What other challenges are there, and how can we best design this program to overcome some of those challenges?
Okay, I'm jumping on that one. Thank you for it. I think it's a critical question, actually, we have to look. I think you are mentioning probably 4 pillars of the main challenge that we all face as agencies and governments. I think there is also internally some of our internal challenges related to not always a clear predictability where the funding is being invested and how it's being invested. I mean, when we are talking about that we need to have long-term plans, that we have to be clear what is the envelope for funding, that really doesn't help to build long-term development and sustainability that we want. If we keep moving to a more project approach where we find a small thing here and a small thing in the other way, we are going to be actually increasing some of those risks because we are going to spreading too much the level of accountability that we have to follow up. But if we are able to have a clear investment, a clear plan, that's why the focus has to be about where the investment must to be. It will be easier to actually minimize some of these issues because we will be able to identify those countries we are going to focus on how to strengthen the transparency and accountability within the government. In those countries, we are going to work in strengthening the civil society. Or with this specific funding, we can really have a more honest conversation with partners in where their overhead is going. Because right now, I think the level of unpredictability that we have in funding mechanisms, I think that hasn't really helped as much as we all wanted. And I don't know if that answered a little bit your question.
I think you've enumerated a number of concerns that really do soak up a lot of the aid investment dollars. I think one of the aspects is counterbalances or checks and balances, and having resources not just go to one level of government or to one NGO or to one multilateral really helps with some of that. It increases, actually, while we should have a cooperative spirit in this, some of those competitive metrics keep us all honest. What we've found is that we are able to work with local community actors wherein, we try and identify all along the strata, whether it's at the national level, at a regional level, or a local level, who are the power actors who can actually be influenced to do what's right and to ensure best value for dollar in their community context. As we identify some of those, they're able to advocate for better impacts for their community. One of the things that we found very helpful is something we call citizens' voice in action, which is really empowering local actors that they may at first say, we want to ensure better development outcomes as it relates to education in our community. And the breakdown is that, maybe we have teachers and we have books, but the caliber of teaching is not up to snuff, or the teachers don't actually show up, even though they're paid for. And so they are able to band together and advocate with the local government or even at the national government level to say, these things are not being upheld, and it's sort of like giving them a microphone or a megaphone that they can advocate for those things. And we're trying to do that at different levels where we may identify at one level. I remember in China, I was approached by a local official who said, we weren't really keen on working with you at first when you came in our community, but we saw your concern, your care, and the impact on children in these communities, and we realized as party officials, we wanted to replicate this in other areas. And so it changed it from a combative relationship to a collaborative relationship. I think stitching that together is one of the ways that we can do this, and whether it's NGO community, government actors, civil society, faith-based actors, there are different capillaries that can get development into areas to actually address the real needs of men, women, and children.
Thank you. Mr. Janis, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. I'd like to start a question for the representatives of World Vision. You talked about a fragility index that you have, and also kind of within that assessment looking at I guess the vulnerability of countries, the relative vulnerability. And I've asked a number of witnesses, and I'm curious for your thoughts on how human rights play into that, how that plays into your fragility index, the situation of religious, ethnic, linguistic minorities, how that affects your assessment of the need for aid, and how that maybe informs the approach that you think should be taken uniquely in those situations.
I think really what partly what's being pointed to is any aspects of, we need to be attentive to various aspects of vulnerability and poverty, and this is multidimensional. And so anywhere where there is a marginalization of a particular community, be it an ethnic or a political ideology or a religious minority, we do need to be attentive to and sensitive to those sort of fissures and fault lines, where entire communities can be segregated or left out of the development based on they belong to, the wrong ethnic tribe, and so those certainly are embedded within a view that we need to take. We want to ensure that development assistance is centered on human beings. And really, that is sort of stripped away from all of those other trappings. It's about individuals in those communities, and we do need to look at those practices that might prey upon someone's difference in those communities and ensure that that's part of the index.
Thank you. I want to make sure I get at least one more question before the time's up, but I'll just maybe ask if anybody else in the panel has a comment on how we be attentive to human rights in general, minority rights in particular, in the context of our development assistance.
I think I would just add that those marginalized are often those who are having their rights violated. So whether they're ethnic minorities, religious minorities, linguistic minorities, they're often the ones who are at the fringes, and they're the ones who require increased assistance. And if we do that, we're actually able to make gains for entire communities, whether that's here in Canada or here. It's just a principle of working with marginalized communities.
The only last point will be, I think, is targeting inequality, because even in those cases that we see injustice in minorities, we also see that within these minorities or these situations, women are actually even disproportionately affected. So I think that the element of inequality should be the one that we look at, because that's going to actually be able to measure any inequality that is going to be measured against the human rights.
Thank you very much. We recently went through hearings for a study on women, peace, and security, and we heard a little bit about some of the funding challenges that grassroots organizations on the ground have. The point was made that there are many grassroots organizations located in other countries that are doing very effective work. In that context, it was on women's equality issues, but they had a harder time accessing international funding, especially funding for sort of core activities. And perhaps some of the reasons were there was issues around reporting and complying with accountability standards when you've got relatively small organizations dealing with international partners. And I know all of you represent fairly large international organizations, so I would like to hear your thoughts on kind of working with small on-the-ground grassroots organizations and how we can be more attentive to their funding needs, and perhaps the fact that they're not as able to kind of be accountable in quite the same way that a large organization with larger capacity would be.
Well, I think I could even speak in the name of the three organizations. We actually work, even we at the big organizations, we're actually working with the local organizations. I mean, the way that we engage with partners is the way that we work. The level of interventions that development agencies have been the front line with our own staff is minimum and minimum, because there's more capacity on countries. And the other piece will be that actually probably part of our job actually is to build capacity on those organizations so that they can do the job, and actually not only do the job that is on the line that they understand better how to do the job, but up to the standards that actually taxpayers or agencies are going to ask. And I think probably today, I will say that almost any Canadian organization working overseas is really very engaged in partnerships with local organizations. And if not, it should be. Actually, it will be part of the things that we have to be sure is that we are not doing it by our own anymore.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the last question to Mr. Fragascatos, our last questioner.
Sure.
Thank you very much to all of you for appearing today. My question builds on what Mr. Aubin spoke about, or asked about, rather. From you, I've heard no clear opposition to the countries of focus approach. There was some concern around perhaps it's more appropriate to focus on a regional basis rather than a country-specific approach. But even the commentary on LDCs and middle-income states, the fact that middle-income states, I think the number was 73% that was quoted. 73% of the world's poor live in middle-income states. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So from there, I don't hear, once again, clear opposition to the policy. And I assume from that perhaps you think Canada should continue with the countries of focus approach, but there could be points of reform that we could focus on. Number one, is my assumption correct? And number two, could each of you point to, yes, in 6 minutes, one or two reforms that the countries of focus approach could, that we could see with that, since this is a study focusing specifically on that policy?
I can start. So UNICEF Canada is not advocating for countries of focus. So I'll repeat that. We're not advocating for countries of focus. What we are advocating for is a focus on the most vulnerable people, thematic focus. Investing wisely, investing in children. We know that they're the best investment you can make, and investing in the underfunded areas of the Sustainable Development Goals. So those are areas where I think Canada can look to modify its existing strategy. Canada's already focused on children and youth, so continue that. And Canada needs to be flexible. I think this has come up time and time again here from our colleagues. Aid needs to be flexible. Canada needs to be nimble to be able to respond to things like Ebola, to respond to things like Zika, respond to the Syrian crisis, respond to the Nigeria Plus conflict if that blows up. We need to make sure that we have that flexibility so we can respond to the greatest need and to do that in a way that is responsible and it isn't just a Band-Aid solution.
Yeah, I think similar. First, I think we are not discussing about how the humanitarian assistance should be focused, because that shouldn't be focused. I mean, humanitarian assistance is very clear how it responds to the needs. When we talk about we need to focus more on poor people and not in poor countries, is because that's going to be one of the elements. Our point is there's going to be some kind of focus because we cannot go anywhere, but the way that focus is what is really our suggestion. It will be around the criteria, how the criteria that we identified that is going to give us some focus is going to really target the inequality at the poorest of the poor, and how those criteria are going to be aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals that we all have agreed.
Could you touch on those key criteria for you?
Well, I can talk about the ones that we are looking at as an agency, and again, inequality will be one of the most important ones. I think that looking at an index that measures any kind of inequality will be critical, because that's what we have seen that is not bringing us to the level of development that we all envision with the Millennium Development Goals. And we also know that the more equal the country is, the more developed it's going to be. So that will be one element. Other indicators are going to be very specific or more technical. I think, for instance, looking at malnutrition or looking at mortality and maternal mortality are two critical indicators that are going to tell us a lot about what is going on in that specific country beyond actually the nutrition and the mortality rate. So there will be more. The other one I think is critical is climate change, because we are going to be looking at the long-term plans, and climate change is having an impact in that long term. So looking about what are the countries, what are the communities that are, or the regions that are going to be more affected, are going to be critical, because we cannot be having a plan. If we decide to have that plan, we cannot be having a plan that changes in 5 years. And the other one I think has to be criteria that allow us to be flexible, because the reality of the communities that we work with, that we serve, is that things change. And we cannot be just very, very rigid on that one. And I think that will be probably what's going to be more difficult in the policy side.
I'll hand this mostly to my colleague Rachel, but I think one of the realities just of this particular piece is that though 73% may be residing in middle-income countries right now, the trend lines are what we need to watch out for, and the volatility is such that some of these things that we're listening to right now, Zika or Ebola, are things that we really didn't hear much about when the last priorities were set. So I don't want to dodge the question. In a sense, we're a little bit agnostic on the country prioritization, as long as there's flexibility in there to meet the changing realities as it affects human beings writ large in these contexts. And some of that I think Rachel can speak to if we...
Sure. One of the things we wanted to make clear today is to sort of turn on its head this idea of fragility and see that, whether it's in a middle-income country or low-income country, addressing what that means and how that is going to impact the world moving forward is critical. And so we spoke today about violence, how violence in countries that we would see as middle-income but are causing mass displacement into other countries, that has an impact. So looking beyond these countries we would perceive as darlings in development, moving forward, doing great things with work, we have to see that there's pockets of vulnerability within these countries. And so what our recommendation to the Canadian government is, as you look at these countries of priority, is identifying who within these various countries, whether they are considered middle income or conflict affected, who are the most vulnerable, and targeting the aid towards those people.
Chair, one quick.
I don't think so.
Follow up. That's any consolation. I was going to pull Michael Levitt.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, though, Mr. Fragiskatis. And unfortunately, my job as the chair sometimes is not as enjoyable as it should be. But I wanted to take this opportunity to thank UNICEF, of course, World Vision, and Care Canada for making this presentation. One question to take away and to come back with us in writing, if you will. It's clear that if you take a look at the countries of focus since 2000, there's only 8 countries that have been consistent throughout this last 16 years. And so what that tells us is that there has been some change. And to go to Mr. Albuquerque's document of our need to look at this more in the long term, I'd be very interested in the approach to that vis-a-vis if we have 25 countries or 40 countries of focus. It seems to me we've been rotating countries as it is over the last 16 because, as I said, only about 8 are consistent throughout from 2000 on. So I wanted you to think about that because that's sort of comes to the issue you've been speaking to. And then, but it also is contrary to your interest and vision of being flexible and then being able to move here and there and everywhere. So there may be a couple issues or ways we can do that from a funding perspective and from a policy perspective. So be very interested in your comments in writing if you could and helping the committee with those major issues. So on behalf of the committee, I want to thank you very, very much and look forward to hearing from you in the not too distant future. Colleagues, we're going to take 2 minutes and then we're going to go right to our next presenters. Yeah, have a seat. We need a clerk, yeah. Colleagues, please take your seats. So the second hour, roughly, we will hear from some individual academics, which is very important to this process as well. And so the individuals before you are Francois Odette, Mr. Monroe, and Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown is the professor of School of Political Studies, University of Ottawa, and Mr. Monroe is the director, School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa, and Francois Odette is the professor of School of Management, Université du Québec à Montréal. So, I'm not sure. The list shows Mr. Brown first, so Mr. Brown, why don't you start?
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Huneau.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm very pleased to be here today to speak to you about Canada's international development assistance. As Mr. Nolt said, I am a professor at the University of Ottawa, and I work on development assistance issues for at least 10 years, and I've been working on Canadian development issues for about 15 years. And I'm very pleased to talk to you a little bit about my research, the results of my research, at least in the medium term, if not in the long term. I've published a lot of articles about Canada's international development assistance, including a chapter that I sent to the clerk today. I don't know if it will be possible to distribute that to the committee members later, but that would be good. I'm also co-director, or co-editor rather, of several books on the subject, one of which is going to be appearing soon. It's called Rethinking Canadian Aid.
If that would be welcome. I'm very happy to be talking about the question of focus because I think it's quite a red herring in foreign aid programs, not just Canada's. I think there's too much emphasis being put on which countries and which sectors, and the idea that if we just get the countries right and we just get the sectors right or the themes right, Canada or whatever country we're talking about will have a much more effective aid program. There's actually no evidence that focusing on a smaller number of countries or themes increases aid effectiveness. And I believe my colleague Lachlan Monroe will be talking about that. He's published on this. He makes a very compelling case. What I would like to say is that it introduces an element of flavor of the month. It's not quite the month because it usually takes a few years for priorities to change. But if we look at the Chrétien government, they actually changed pretty frequently, often every time there was a new minister. So a new minister would come in, agriculture was put on the list. The next minister would come in, agriculture would come off, children would come on. Even if we only revise our themes and our countries every few years, this introduces many elements that are actually contrary to aid effectiveness principles. One thing that's pretty obvious would be volatility or unpredictability, that Canada cannot be seen as a reliable partner with specific countries or working on specific themes. It can also lead to over-concentration. If we're picking themes that are trendy internationally, then we're following the herd. We're spending money where everybody else is spending money, and we're neglecting themes that are neglected by other donors. In terms of countries, let me illustrate some of the quandary that Canadian aid has been in because of this rotating list. So Burkina Faso and Benin were introduced as countries of focus or development partners, depending on the terminology used at the time. They were added to the list in 2005. They were not previously on the list. They were added in 2005, removed in 2011, and added again in 2014. I think you can understand that this is not a formula for effective aid or being a reliable partner. having a list of countries of focus also constrains us needlessly. It introduces new problems when something happens in a certain country and we don't wish to continue our aid there. For instance, soon after Burkina Faso was re-added to the list in 2014, there was a coup and Canada suspended aid. Recently, Canada suspended aid to Mozambique, a country of focus, because of corruption. Aid was suspended to Mali, a country of focus, because of a coup, and aid was suspended to Haiti, a long-standing country of focus, or at least suspended as well. So this introduces a very unhealthy dynamic if what we care about is aid effectiveness. To me, the question of focus is mainly one of branding. It's one to be able to say that we, Canada, or the Canadian government, or quite often we, the political party in power, have this as our branded aid program. This is what we do. And what I would say that this is in many ways very limiting. And you heard from the previous witnesses about how it constrains countries in terms of lack of flexibility. If Ebola comes up and you're working in one country but not another, this hampers efforts. The targets of having 75 or 80 or 90% of your bilateral aid focused in one country is not driven by effectiveness. It's driven by the idea that you can say this and it looks good to the Canadian public, to the media, or other actors. I would abolish the list of countries of focus. I think we should focus on certain types of countries, and I would agree with people from the previous panel who talked about low-income countries and fragile states. It doesn't mean that we should not provide assistance in middle-income countries, but I think our focus, even if we don't name the countries, should be in low-income and fragile states. If you choose not to follow my advice and want to maintain a list, I do have a few recommendations. One would be to drop Ukraine. Ukraine is not even a developing country in most people's perspective. It is literally at the border of the European Union, and they are much better equipped to provide assistance. It is also not a country with a lot of absorptive capacity right now due to great instability and corruption. Other countries that have made their way on the list that I don't think should be priorities for Canada, whether they're named or not, would be Colombia, Mongolia, and Peru. I think we also need to take into account the issue of donors, of donor darlings and orphans. We can't just think isolated, what should Canada do, but we need to look what other countries are doing. So, for instance, Mozambique. Everybody's in Mozambique. Does Canada also need to be in Mozambique? There are some countries like Central African Republic that were neglected for a long time by all the donors, and this had maybe not a direct, but at least an indirectly detrimental effect and reinforced instability in that country. Myanmar is another example. It was added to Canada's list in 2014. I think it's part of a global rush, not only to have a presence in Myanmar, but to have access to Myanmar's mineral resources. So I do not think that these are good reasons to have these countries as a country of focus. I'm especially interested in the criteria, if Canada continues to select countries of focus, what the criteria will be. Until recently on the Global Affairs website, one of the criteria was the country's alignment with Canadian foreign policy. I noticed today that it's no longer there. I was actually happy to see that it was no longer there because alignment with Canadian foreign policy is not about development, it's about Canada. It can often harm aid effectiveness, and it is not the purpose of foreign aid. Foreign aid is defined by Canadian law to be all about poverty reduction, and the definition agreed to, including by Canada, the OECD DAC of official development assistance, means it has to be directed towards the welfare of the recipient country. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about themes, and I'm aware that I should probably go too quickly, though the interpreters might not like that, because we're running late and I certainly don't want to steal time from my colleagues here. Regarding themes, again, the tendency has been flavor of the month. As I mentioned before, every time we had a new minister or a new government, we had new themes. I noticed that the brief or the instructions that I received for the discussion here today, or perhaps it's the mandate for this committee, is to talk about, quote, the sectoral themes that the Canadian government has prioritized, namely food security, sustainable economic growth, and securing the future of children and youth. I was actually quite surprised by this, because it is my understanding that the Canadian government has already moved on to new themes. I was at a consultation at Global Affairs Canada on Friday, and Ms. Gould, the parliamentary secretary, was there, and we were presented with 6 new themes. So I'm actually interested in perhaps after the hearing from the members of the committee to what extent you're actually examining the old themes when it seems that the new themes have already been decided. Now, I have a lot to say about these new themes, but I won't say it now because of time. If you want to ask me a question about these specific themes, I would be very pleased to share my thoughts with you, and also some thoughts from what I've seen on the consultation process. One question I have about themes, and I've been following them for the past decade or more, is whether they actually mean anything. Sometimes we have so many themes that you can fit almost anything into them, in which case it doesn't actually provide any focus at all. In other cases, it could be that they do have an influence, but in that case, it's mainly about branding and about being able to say, this is what we do. So in 2009, when we had new themes, we included food security because that was a hot topic at the time. Now these 6 new themes don't include food security. Or do they? Because when I asked about it to Global Affairs officials, they told me from these 6 themes how you could sort of fit food security into 3 of them. So that, to me, suggested that it's not about actually changing the work, it's about changing the optics. And I don't think that that's a very effective use of anybody's time. To conclude, I would say that Canada should not focus on specific themes unless we take a global theme, like poverty reduction, or maybe add in inequality, because those are the real purposes of aid. What we do should be focused on reducing and perhaps even eliminating poverty, and reducing inequality. I don't think we can reduce inequality, but this is what's defined in the ODA Accountability, the ODA Accountability Act. We should not be entertaining reasons of trade and investment, as has been the case in the past. And I think that a less partisan, reducing the amount of partisan branding of particular themes and countries of focus would create more staying power. So to conclude, to me, focus is not the magic bullet. It should not actually be the main topic under discussion if we want to improve Canadian aid. If the committee is interested, we can talk about other things that would improve Canadian aid, such as decentralization, empowering people on the ground, giving decision-making power to people on the ground and spending power to people on the ground who understand what is going on in the country. We heard about the need to be nimble. You cannot be nimble when you're in Ottawa and don't have a strong sense of what's going on the ground and need 23 signatures in 3.5 years to get any new project approved. So I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Mr. Monroe.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, les membres du comité.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. I will be speaking to you in English today, but if you'd like to ask questions or make comments in French, I would be more than happy to answer in the official language of your choice.
Provide aid to foreign countries for a variety of different reasons. Sometimes we seek to alleviate poverty overseas. Sometimes we want to help to contribute to some global public good. Sometimes we want to win friends and influence people abroad, and sometimes we contribute funding just so that we can have a seat at the table and know what's going on in that part of the world. Overarching all of these objectives is, of course, a concern that public funds should be spent wisely, effectively, and honestly. Sometimes these various objectives come into conflict with each other. We saw an example of that under the last government, where the policy of focusing our aid on fewer countries in the name of greater aid effectiveness came into conflict with our objective of winning friends and influencing people to get them to vote us onto the UN Security Council. The idea that Canada's aid should be focused on fewer recipient countries is rooted in the objective of aid effectiveness. The idea of greater country focus is, as my colleague Stephen Brown has said, an old one. Indeed, I suspect I was invited here today because over a decade ago I wrote an article on this, and I entitled my article, Focus Pocus. I have long been and continued to be a skeptic on country focus as a way of increasing aid effectiveness. Focusing aid on fewer countries makes intuitive sense, and that's why the idea became and has stayed popular in policy and media circles. Working in fewer countries means we have fewer overhead costs for each country program. If we work in fewer countries, we get to know their problems better, and we can work more effectively with them to solve their problems. Or so the argument goes. Why then do I remain a skeptic about the benefits of country focus as a way of increasing the effectiveness of Canada's aid program? Well, first of all, I know of no evidence whatsoever to prove the assertion that working in fewer countries increases a given aid program's effectiveness. Not for Canada, not for any other country. I'm not even aware of any attempt to construct a measure of aid effectiveness for bilateral programs that could then be correlated with a measure of country focus. While country focus may make intuitive sense, the lack of concrete evidence to support this notion is absolutely striking. The idea that aiding fewer countries will make Canada's aid program more effective is faith-based policymaking, not evidence-based policymaking. The most focused bilateral aid program in the world, as far as I know, is Belgian cooperation. Historically, well over half of Belgium's aid has gone to a single recipient country, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Without wishing any disrespect to my Belgian friends and colleagues, I know of no one who will tell you that Belgium's is the best bilateral aid program in the world, or even close to it. But if Canada did focus its aid on fewer countries in the name of aid effectiveness, would that be enough? Would Canada's aid suddenly become more effective if we gave it to fewer countries? It might, but if and only if Canada did other things to increase its aid effectiveness. I've argued before this committee in the past that the first step in aid effectiveness should be a fundamental rethink of the tsunami of bureaucratic rules, oversight, and risk and results-based management procedures that have engulfed our good public servants in recent years under governments of all political stripes in the name of accountability. And I hasten to add, lest I be accused of being partisan, I cannot recall any opposition party denouncing this tendency either. Moreover, the logic of bilateral, the logic of country focus tells us that our bilateral aid program would be more effective since, by specializing on fewer countries, we would get to know those countries better. But that logic, if we really followed it, and we haven't, as my colleague has just shown with all the flipping in and out of that list, such a logic would impel us to redesign Global Affairs Canada's whole system of recruitment, training, career development, and rotation. At the risk of oversimplifying somewhat, our current system values generalists, not country or regional experts. Taking country focus seriously would imply a generation-long attention span by politicians and senior public officials to set a list of focus countries and then follow that up with a systematic cultivation of deep expertise on individual countries, including fluency in local vernacular languages. I cannot end without making one final comment on the whole issue of country focus in our bilateral aid program. And that comment is to say that country focus is a very 20th century way of looking at things. It assumes that bilateral aid and bilateral cooperation with independent states is at the heart of the aid and international cooperation business. While that might have been the case 30 or 40 years ago, it is no longer the case. Today, the most interesting and important challenges in international development and international cooperation all cross national borders. Climate change, new and emerging diseases like Zika, Ebola, and SARS, international peace and security, the fight against transnational organized crime, including terrorism, international financial instability, none of these problems will be solved or even dented by bilateral aid programs. They can only be addressed by international, indeed global cooperation. At the next level down, the more mundane but nonetheless important issues like river basin management, the construction of regional infrastructure projects, and the movement of refugees requires transnational networks of projects that are consciously linked and complementary with each other. Focusing our bilateral program on fewer countries is not inherently a bad idea, but it is no magic bullet, and it is an unproven idea. In fact, one that's never been tried. Furthermore, and more importantly, we have reason to believe that the frontiers of development cooperation lie elsewhere, in areas where cooperation must be multilateral, not bilateral, and where developing countries must be brought in as equal participants in the search for solutions to problems that are global and networked and beyond the power of any single actor, even the most powerful, to conquer. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Thank you for your attention.
Mr. Monroe will now go to Mr. Odette. Mr. Odette.
Bonjour.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I'm a professor at UQAM. I work in the Management Sciences School, and before that I worked for CARE Canada and also the Red Cross for several years. So I was sort of a practitioner on the ground before, and now I've become a researcher. Don't worry, I'm not too schizophrenic in my approach.
But as did my colleague, if there's any question in English, I'll be happy to respond.
So I tried to structure my presentation to respond to the 4 questions that we were asked. So I was very theoretical in my approach. My colleagues, I think, really demonstrated a lot of the points that I wanted to make. So I feel very reassured that we all came to the same conclusion. So I'll try not to be too redundant, and I'll focus more specifically on my recommendations. Beyond what my colleagues said about the lack of evidence about regional focus or countries of focus, I would say that as someone who previously worked on the ground, and as Mr. Brown also said, I think that the geographical focus still is really the object of a consensus, although it's not really scientific in basis. It seems very logical and reasonable, though. So to come back to what Mr. Brown said, there's this idea of predictability, how important predictability is. We want to work with countries that are able to get tax income and that have a predictable system. If they can't have long-term planning for their own policies, then we can't be a good partner to them. So it's really important to work with regions or countries. The idea of working with countries is logical in that idea. The other idea, which I'll say again, is this idea that geographical focus can help local capacity building. So it can help create predictability and create local institutions that can develop. But unfortunately, very often, there are a lot of shortcomings in the governance of these countries, and if we can't work with local governance, then we can't be a good partner either. So that's important too. The second question was, should Canada focus on bilateral aid for a smaller number of countries? So it's sort of like the first question. I won't repeat what my colleague said, but I think that there has been a failure. Our country has not been able to remain focused on one single country. Neither have other countries. As was said, I've looked at the recent statistics about Canada's bilateral aid. It's offered to 130 countries on the planet out of 198 countries in total. So, I think it's really fundamental not to be too focused on countries of focus and not to get too obsessed with reducing our number of the number of countries who receive bilateral aid. Now, I think Canada is a particular country. It has its own history, its own diaspora. It's a bilingual country. We have a lot of bilateral and multilateral agreements. And there have been a lot of politicians and ministers in the past who have fallen under the influence of, or who have been pressured to respond positively to be a so-called good international player. But I think if you really want to be a good international player, you also need to be able to say no and to restrict some of your choices. The example of Belgium was mentioned. There are also other countries who have very limited countries of focus that have had better results, like Denmark. For example, Canada could look to Denmark for inspiration on that level. You can look that Denmark. You can see that Denmark provides aid to Bolivia, and the results have been good, although there have been difficulties. The third question was, how should the Canadian framework take into account the situation of different countries? At the end of this terrible Ebola crisis, earthquakes, climate change, the rise of the Islamic State, and so on, I think that Canada doesn't have any other choice. Canada has to incorporate humanitarian assistance and the protection of civilians within its assistance programs. Now, these are not necessarily themes that are country-focused. They're really much more thematic in terms of regions, and we really need to look at them scientifically to understand the issues in those regions, to be able to respond on a geographical level, not just on a country-by-country level, because these are very broad phenomena that everyone is facing these days. Another recommendation on the same question, unlike my colleague Mr. Brown, I believe that Canada should withdraw from medium-income countries. Ukraine was mentioned. That's not a good country for receiving our aid. And the goal should be to reduce the number of countries of focus, and then also to significantly reduce Canadian assistance by looking at the vulnerability of the populations rather than our own economic opportunities. The fourth question, before I get to my recommendations, should Canada try to focus on the 2030 agenda when it makes decisions about aid? I think it's interesting to see that the UN objectives have always proven to be unattainable and unrealistic. So essentially, the MDGs failed, and now we've changed the name, and we're starting all over again. But so this is sort of like a roadmap for donor countries, and it allows us to try to coordinate our efforts to a certain extent, and that really is a crucial aspect. It's probably even more important than having a geographic focus. I would also say that Canada needs to support this initiative while maintaining added value. On the subject of added value, well, this actually segues into my 5 recommendations. First of all, Canada absolutely needs to avoid falling into the trap of smoke and mirrors. Sometimes it can be difficult to make political decisions, but I think it's very important to withdraw aid in a logical way from medium-income countries. Secondly, we need to ensure that capacity building and local governance are the main focus of everything that we do. In my experience, the biggest consensus, if we want to emancipate poor countries, is this. So eventually we need to withdraw funding from medium-income countries. And we need to work with our partners to do that. And we need to ensure that all of these methodologies serve the strengthening of local institutions. Now, Care Canada, my former employer, said that they can't always finance local institutions if they don't go through Canadian intermediaries. And Mr. Brown also said earlier that it's important to decentralize aid and to have local decision-making, because local populations and governments are best placed to understand how they can free themselves from poverty. Then we need to ensure that women are really at the heart of development. I won't talk a lot more about this because I believe that the current government and Minister Bibeau already made a speech recently about that, and I was very, very satisfied to hear that this gender aspect is a priority for the current government. Fourth, We need to work on Canada's added value in terms of implementation. So with bilateral aid and NGOs, we need to do that. Of course, I can answer questions about this later, but we are dealing with the fact that we are a bilingual country, so it makes sense to intervene in French-speaking countries, English-speaking countries as well. But India and Ukraine, I think, are perhaps not a good use of taxpayer money. In terms of added value, we can look at water, health, economic development, and we need to maintain that significant sum for crises, for emergency aid. That is a very useful tool that allows us to respond quickly to a whole range of crises faced by people around the world. A final point, this is particularly important to me and my colleagues, it has to do with research and building Canadian research capacity. What does that mean? Well, today, Canada's aid policy essentially depends on American policy and European policy. So, I mean, U.S. and European policy. Why? Well, most of our humanitarian and development organizations actually originated in the U.S. or in Europe, and they depend on other external capacities. So they need to build their own networks for research and analysis. And there sometimes is a biased perception of reality within those organizations. So it's important that Canada work with these organizations, with researchers, and with everyone in the community to create stronger institutions that are able to conduct research, to get facts and statistics, and to inform you as much as possible so that you can make the right political decisions. To conclude, the questions that you're asking today are very legitimate and necessary ones, but as I said, they're sort of a symptom of the fact that we still have too little information, too little data about the real results of our aid. We need to better understand what really works and what doesn't work. The aid environment is far too controlled by NGOs, and it doesn't necessarily promote learning correct lessons. It's sort of presented as a charity business, and we're not necessarily up to date with what's going on in Europe, for example. We need to better understand successes and failures to find better solutions. Unfortunately, many times the failures are hidden, and we just repeat the same things over and over. To conclude, I would mention that the Department of International Cooperation gave $130 million, $1 million rather, to various other countries, and nothing to a specific capacity-building organization in Canada. So the Canadian government currently has resources and encourages capacity building outside of our country, but today we have very few resources in terms of research and in terms of Canadian organizations who depend on an international network to develop Canadian public policy. So I'm convinced that if we reinvest in our capacities and research, we will be able to make better decisions and eventually to have much better data for our conversations in the committee.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Audette, and to all three of you. We're going to go straight to questions, and I think we'll start with Mr. Allison.
Sure. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. This was great to have a different perspective, and certainly one that will cause us to think a little bit more. Mr. Brown, I have to go. You said you'd like to talk with the 6 new thematic thoughts that our country's looking at. Would you care to share those and give us your thoughts on those?
How long do I have?
I have 6 minutes. So.
Is the committee aware of what these 6 themes are? No. Okay, so let me read them. So my understanding is partial. I participated in these consultations that were held on Friday. It was aimed at NGOs and consultants in international development. We were given 6 themes to discuss, and we broke into groups to discuss each of these 6 themes, which are, 1, health and rights of women and children. And I noticed that Minister Bibeau was already making announcements and press releases around specifically this wording. So to me, it seems like it's already been adopted. Number 2 is green economic growth and climate change. Number 3 is governance, pluralism, diversity, and human rights. Number 4 is peace and security. Number 5 is responding to humanitarian crises. And number 6 is delivering results, improving effectiveness and transparency, innovation, and partnerships. So I still have trouble wrapping my head around that one. But, I mean, part of my problem is the way this consultation took place. To me, it wasn't really a consultation. It was sort of a stage-managed way of getting us to talk about them. But there was no space, because we were broken down into groups, each group of which each table addressed one of these. There was no space to actually say, why these 6 themes? Are these good ideas? Are these themes actually well formulated? For instance, the first one is health of rights in women and children. So my guess is that they took MNCH, which was a Harper government initiative and closely associated with the Prime Minister. They wanted to add sexual and reproductive rights, which was something that the Liberals have already had talked about, and sort of transformed it. So they changed the word mothers to women and then added on rights. But if we're talking about health and rights of women and children, well, why just health and rights? Why not also education? What about human rights that are in number 3? So why are women's rights in number 1 and human rights in number 3? There have been court cases about whether women are people, and I think that's been resolved. So to me, there's overlap there. It seems to be sort of, you have to go into the path dependency of this. It wasn't designed to be effective. It was designed to take the old one and rebrand it and add in the thing that we want. Responding to humanitarian crises, that's something that we do. To me, that's an activity. I don't understand how that's a theme. I don't know, to go back to health and rights of women and children, is that different from gender equality? Is this an overarching theme, a cross-cutting theme, a separate theme? I'm not sure. I don't know what the future consultations will look like, but I hope they will involve some space where people can actually comment on these themes. And we were told time and time again that nothing was set in stone, that everything was up for debate. But the way it was organized, these 6 themes were already decided, and people off the record from Global Affairs Canada said that the minister was very attached to these themes. So I don't quite understand what a consultative process is if the decision's already been made. And like I said, I was surprised, well, I was interested in the fact that food was no longer there, food security. And when I asked about that, does that mean Canada is no longer going to work in food security? I was told that it fits in number 1 because women need good nutrition, especially expecting mothers, and children need nutrition too. That it fits, that agriculture fits under green economic growth and climate change, and that food aid is an important part of responding to humanitarian crises. So that goes back to my previous point. Does this make a difference or not? Because if we're still doing food security and we're now like splitting between these 3, but we're going to keep doing what we're already doing, why does it matter? Why do we need themes? Why do we need to change themes? And if it does make a difference, if we are dropping food security, then can we have a discussion about that?
Thank you. How much more time?
You got another couple of minutes.
Oh, I do? Okay. He didn't use the whole 6 minutes. Thanks, Mr. Rapp. Just to Mr. Monroe, you talked a bit about some of the thought processes, whether it was working collaboratively amongst countries, in terms of investments that were important. And I know one of the things that we've talked about is the whole issue of DFIs and stuff. And I know that's not, the Development Finance Initiative. So just some of your comments on that, because does that lend more into trying to address some of those things that we can't deal with now, or are we late to the party? I know there's we're the last G7 country. What are your thoughts? And I know that's going to be a separate study. I get that, but you did talk about it in terms of the ability to create some of those infrastructure needs that are possible. Do you see that as a vehicle, or is it something else?
I'm not a great expert on DFIs, development finance institutions or initiatives, but let me say this. Yes, you're correct, sir. Canada's late to the party in that. Other people have had such institutions for many decades. The amounts that Canada are putting in is, I believe, a couple of $100 million a year. I mean, when you compare that to international financial institutions like the World Bank, which lend $25 billion a year, and you look at the BRICS Bank, which is aiming to have a capitalization of, I think, $10 billion US dollars, and you can imagine the leveraging of loans that you can make from a capitalization of $10 billion. Well, ours may be a good initiative, I don't know, but it's small potatoes, and it's also hard to do that new initiative and still make the argument that we're focusing even more, because that looks like more spread, not more focus.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And Mr. Fagiscatos, please.
Thank you to all of you for appearing today. In the previous session with UNICEF, with Care Canada, and with World Vision, the last question I wanted to cut off, we didn't have time, was the process by which countries have been put on the list with countries of focus and taken off the list. All of this seems it's a mystery. What have you been able to ascertain in your, and this goes to all of you, in your studies of this? It seems to me that strategic considerations have been paramount, but could you comment on that? And second, this goes to Mr. Monroe and Mr. Brown, both of you have written on the over-concentration of aid as being a problem with the countries of focus approach. Could you expand on that and give examples, perhaps, of where the over-concentration of aid has led to quite negative outcomes?
Should I start with the first one? You start with the second one?
Yeah.
Okay. I've been studying the various criteria since the international policy statement of the Martin government in 2005. That government, and in fact several other iterations, start with the top criterion is where it's needed, and then the second one is where it can be used the best, or the most effectively, and often those two contradict each other, because the poorest countries often have the least capacity, and those that have great capacity to use aid need it the least. So, for instance, China would have a great capacity to use aid to reduce poverty, but it is not a country in great need. And often there's been a third criterion that muddies the water even further. For the Martin government, it was an opaque World Bank score on institutions. For the last iteration under the Harper government, it was alignment with Canadian foreign policy, which I've already spoken against. What my fundamental reading of this is that these criteria could allow you to include any country that you wanted to. They provide absolutely no guidance. They can give you some cover to say, well, it aligns with this one or this one or this one, but they're vague enough that you can put whatever political preference you have. And these are very political preferences in many times, no matter how much people might say otherwise. So I talked to the people at CETA after the international the international policy statement and the new list of 25 countries, and I said, well, isn't this just going to be a liberal initiative, and then when the next government comes in, they're going to change it? They said, no, 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 this is not partisan at all. We've consulted widely. These are the 25 countries. Everybody agrees on them. And then, 4 years later, the countries were changed again by a different government.
Talk about the previous decade and any interviews you've had with NGOs. Under Mr. Harper, were NGOs consulted? You touched on this point, but were you able to find any NGO that was consulted when on this question of adding and subtracting from the list?
As far as I know, there weren't consultations, neither with NGOs nor with the recipient countries themselves. In 2005, when the new list was announced, a number of African countries that were dropped actually found out from the media, which created a lot of tension and might have contributed to hostility towards Canada's UN Security Council bid. My sense is that this is a very internal process done at the highest level, that even employees in what was then CETA and now Global Affairs Canada were not involved in this process.
Sometimes reality kicks. I think the very first list of focus countries from, correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen, 2001,
might have been
2001 or 2002, didn't have Iraq or Afghanistan on it. Then reality kicked in. There were a couple of major wars in those countries, and Canadian aid ramped up, and then, glory be to God, the next iteration of the list included those countries on the list because it had happened already. Reality kicked in. There are other considerations that one has to suspect. Again, Ukraine, one has to wonder whether Canadian electoral politics don't play into that.
You think they did?
That's just a fact, I think. To go to your question on overconcentration, sir, my fear isn't so much overconcentration on a few countries. There are one or two examples, and Monsieur Audet has correctly identified Denmark, and I think Norway is another case where countries have, and they tend to be small countries, and they tend to be countries, donor countries with no colonial history or very little colonial history, have focused on a few countries and a few lines of business. The Norwegians for a couple of decades got really good at peace building and peace negotiations and those sorts of things. But, it was a real cross-party consensus. It lasted an awful long time. It was cultivated by, generations of ministers and also helped, frankly, by a long tradition of coalition governments in those countries. So you can make it work. You can make country focus work. My point is that if you just say, here's our list of countries, and even if you do focus on them, and history suggests that Canada makes these lists and then does something different, but even if you do focus your aid on those countries, it's not enough just to give more aid to fewer countries. You have to address the issue of what I call the tsunami of regulations and risk management and rules and regulations. You have to decentralize to the Canadian missions in the field. A decade ago, it was said that the average Dutch ambassador in Africa had a higher spending authority than the Canadian Minister for International Development. I mean, so you have to address those issues if your aid is going to be effective in those fewer countries that you give your money to. You have to develop deep, long-term knowledge. You have to rotate the staff in Global Affairs Canada so they spend some time on the West Africa desk, then they in Burkina Faso for 5 years, they go back to the West Africa desk, they come back to West Africa later, they learn local languages, they develop deep regional or local expertise. I think if you looked at the rotation patterns in Global Affairs Canada over the last 20 years, you will see that deep cultivation of country-based expertise is the exception, not the rule.
You touch on red tape. If you could take it up, send me an article, or send the committee an article with specific examples, or bring it up in an answer to follow or in concluding remarks, whatever you want to do.
Thank you, Mr. Fragascatos, and I'll go to Mr. Aubin, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci, Messieurs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being with us. I think the last thing we could accuse you of is not wanting to talk, so you certainly had very refreshing and interesting presentations. First, I have a question for Mr. Audet. This is a very quick study. We only have 3 meetings to hear from witnesses, and that hasn't allowed us to have certain Quebec people around the table. So could you tell me, in your experience as a researcher, is there a difference the way people do international aid or organizations do international aid in Quebec compared to the rest of Canada or elsewhere? Well, if I'm not mistaken, I think there really are 2 solitudes when it comes to international cooperation at every level, even within global affairs. I think it's probably the same here. There are always separate networks. And it also has to do with traditions and value systems. There are differences on those levels too. And beliefs that vary from one region of Canada to another as well. So Canada has a missionary past, which is fairly well recognized. Some parts of Canada have become more secularized, others not so much. So there are different traditions within organizations that are different. And the way we represent ourselves abroad is also a little bit different. What I've noticed is that there are variations depending on the type of organization and the government in power, because some organizations feel that they represent a certain government more than another. So there's a real diversity in Canada, in one sense. And that's probably what accounts for the diversity of our capacities, of our expertise, of our identity. We express all of these things differently in different parts of the world. We have diasporas from all over the world. So as soon as there's a request for assistance, there's always a community in Canada saying, okay, we need to go forward with this, so we can't leave these people by the wayside. So to answer your question, yes, I think that overall there are definite distinctions between Quebec and the rest of Canada. Thank you. My next question is for Mr. Brown. I was really interested by your idea that there's like the flavor of the month. And you certainly say that the bilateral approach is passé and that we need to have a more multilateral approach. So can Canada be a leader and a champion and a coordinator of this multilateral cooperation so that every country involved in international development in a given country work together so that we can avoid redundancy and find better solutions? Could Canada be a coordinator of such multilateral programs? Yes, absolutely. Canada has been a leader in the past on development issues. For example, we were a leader in terms of gender equality and also in terms of support for NGO development initiatives in the 70s, 80s, early 90s. Then there was a bit of a withdrawal from multilateral institutions over the last 10 years or so, but it's entirely possible for us to re-engage with those institutions and to show leadership once again. But we need a different approach when we do our branding. So we need to have more collaboration. We can't simply say, we're going to do this, and so you should follow us. You should do the same. The approach should really be to listen to our partners, to work with them. It's also important to remember that development aid in the 21st century no longer fits the stereotype of, well, you know, we in Canada have certain comparative advantages and expertise in certain areas, and so we have to focus on those areas. Things don't work like that anymore. You can't simply send Canadians who are experts in nutrition, for example, to a given country and solve the entire problem. Local governments and local institutions have their own priorities, and Canada signed the Paris Agreement about the efficiency or the effectiveness of aid 15 years ago. And we have committed to respecting the priorities of local countries and local ownership, and we need to align with their priorities. So when we put too much emphasis on our priorities, we're really going against that commitment that we made. So we need a more collaborative approach. For example, if we think it's important to work on vaccinations, immunizations, it shouldn't be because Canada has expertise in that area. If we believe it's important and there is a need for additional funding, then we shouldn't limit our support to that area. For example, if we need to make a contribution to Gavi or another institution working in that area, that's what we need to do. Thank you. Do I still have some time, Mr. Chair? Question for Mr. Monroe. I have the impression that you may have had to cut your presentation a little bit short for lack of time, but it seemed to me that you were starting to talk about how we had to make Canadian aid more efficient. For example, you mentioned the problem of bureaucracy. Certainly, I think there is some money to be gained there that would allow us to dedicate more money to on-the-ground work. But I imagine you have other aspects of that question to talk about, other ways that we could increase the efficiency of our work with the same amount of money? Well, everyone wants to find a silver bullet, but it doesn't exist. As Mr. O'Day, like Mr. O'Day, I am a former worker for UNICEF. I worked on the ground. And at UNICEF, we were always very happy to come to Canada to meet with CETA. Even though their priorities changed all the time, it was always possible to talk about kids and to get them to make children one of their priorities. Sometimes I had to be creative in the way that I would write the reports or proposals. Of course, you always had to be very careful. I was the main writer of a 4-year strategic plan for UNICEF, so I listened to all of the senior officials in CETA. I made sure I worded everything exactly the way they wanted and talked about the subjects they wanted. I forget if it was agriculture. No, it was social development at the time that they were really interested in. So I would talk about social development, children, say exactly what they wanted to hear. And that's how the game is played. Regardless of the priorities that you set, development officers in their NGOs have their own priorities. They have their own mandates. And UNICEF will always find a way to insert itself into their priorities. And the same goes for World Vision and all the other organizations. Having a frequent change of priorities, or frequent changing of the list of countries of focus, has, as a consequence, it makes people work harder within those organizations. They have to be more creative in the way they draft their proposals and reports and evaluations. That's the main consequence. So you need to find a way to get out of that way of playing the game, which is the standard way. Just a very quick answer to come back to what was said earlier. That was my point earlier. We need to be careful not to have the Canadian government be too close with some development organizations. Of course, they need to exist, but they shouldn't be the only standard bearer of our values. Essentially, these NGOs are businesses. They may not make a profit, but they're businesses. And you know, when jobs are created, they remain. They can't be eliminated. And the same goes for these cooperation institutions. So it's important to diversify the organizations that we work with.
Thank you. So I actually want to come back to the issue that I was exploring with the previous guest, and that was around obstacles, particularly as it relates to the delivery end, less in terms of the domestic kind of policy end. If the goal is getting the development dollars where they're needed most, and Professor Brown, you talked about reducing and eliminating poverty and reducing inequality. Factors like civil unrest and conflict in the countries of focus, state corruption, red tape in NGOs, UN agencies, things like admin fees and kind of the money getting batted around before it actually reaches local networks and local actors that are in a position to actually make the difference in a very kind of tangible way. How do we build a system, or how do we adapt or modify our system to remove some of these obstacles so that we can more effectively get the money where it needs to go? And do you see this as a problem? I guess I should ask that first. Do you feel that these obstacles are a problem?
Yes, absolutely. These obstacles are a problem, and there's no easy answer to any of them. I mean, you know, when a civil war breaks out, this is going to hamper your aid delivery, and it will increase overhead costs. But I think all too often what happens is that aid effectiveness is not the determining factor in aid programs, and often they're very political decisions. So the largest program the Canadian government has ever had in foreign aid is in Afghanistan. And that was all about security interests. It was about showing to NATO that Canada was a team player. It was about, and in many ways, the spending was very misguided. So much of the money was wasted. Our focus in Kandahar was related to the fact that we had Canadian troops there, and there was this facile idea that, you know, aid would help win minds and hearts and minds. And these considerations are not helpful for aid effectiveness. We need to take into account things like absorptive capacity. You know, I'm in favor of increasing aid budgets, but I don't think, often we're presented with a false dichotomy that it means you're just throwing money out the window or through the door. I think aid should be smart aid. It should be spent well. It should be, and this requires a Global Affairs Canada that has staff that are well trained, that know what they're doing, that, as we've discussed, are decentralized, that we have presence on the ground with decision-making authority, that can be more nimble. In one of the books I edited, there was a chapter by Molly Den Heyer that talked about budget support to the Tanzanian government. And they would have a donor meeting. And, you know, the UK would say, we're putting this amount, and the Danes would say, we put in this amount. They were doing basket funding that had been negotiated over a long-term period. It was sort of considered, the right way to do aid, not isolated little projects, but this joint support for the government of Tanzania to, I can't remember what sector it was, perhaps education, but to support the education sector rather than just build one school in one community. And the Canadian representative was not actually able to make any commitment and then had to go back to Ottawa. So Canada was the only one at the table who said, I can't tell you, I need to check first. And then it turned out that Treasury Board guidelines prohibited Canada from transferring, I think it was $10 million. So Canada, to the government of Tanzania. So Canada gave it to the World Bank, and then the World Bank gave it to the government of Tanzania. And the World Bank charged, I think it was $1 million as a fee for carrying out this service. So nothing was gained except by the World Bank, and Canada just had to go through this red tape, and the government of Tanzania got $1 million less. So, I mean, part of the problem is, the parts of the problem that we can do the most about are the parts that are internal to Canada. The problems abroad, such as corruption, such as civil strife, and so on, are very, very complex, and that's where we need well-trained, empowered people who are knowledgeable on the ground, who can respond to these issues, who can come up with strategies that are appropriate, not having a cookie-cutter approach, but to design adaptations to programming. So, for instance, if it's no longer a good idea for whatever reason, corruption or something else, to channel money through the government, to refocus, to rechannel it through local NGOs or Canadian or other international NGOs or through the UN, to continue supporting the people of that country and not punish them because we don't want to support their government.
I've heard the complaint made that one of the problems with our international development program that's been for a while is that we chase emergencies, that we're constantly chasing the emergency. You talked about, the trendy cause or the kind of the cause of the day or the month or the year. How do we move away from that? How do we start taking a longer term approach? Is there anything in terms of design that you can think of as a recommendation?
Focus on poverty and political interference. There were so many decisions made in the past where things went into the minister's office and sat there for a year and then came out changed. Or decisions that recommendations for funding of NGOs, for instance, where everybody who knew about the topic, who had studied it, all the people from CEDA and DFATE as it was then, said this is a great project. It goes to the minister's office, the minister signs off on it, and then later inserts a not, reversing that decision. That kind of political interference harms our aid effectiveness because decisions are being made for political reasons and not for the good that these programs can actually do. So whether it's political preferences, security considerations, perhaps wanting to favor NGOs from your riding or your home region or, something like that, these should not be part of the decision-making process.
Professor Dutt?
Well, just quickly to your two questions. If you ask me if Canadian aid is effective, I would say yes. I think that the result of our project are quite good in general. But we have to be realistic to what aid can really do in a country, in any country around the world. It's nothing in comparison to the global economy, and even to the economy of one country, especially for a country like Canada. So we have to be careful when we are asking ourselves as a country, as a government, are we effective, and against what exactly? What are the criteria or the management issue in there? The second thing is this is clearly an issue all over Canada about the problem of chasing emergency. It's not every country, every donor's country are like that, but I think the best way to change that or to modify the pattern of our behavior is certainly the the education of the public. The politic interference is coming with the pressure of the public. So if the public understand better what is happening outside our borders, we will be quite better informed in terms of society, and probably quite less pressure for a minister or a government to take a decision only because they have microphones on every morning. Okay, what's happening in there? This earthquake, this and that. So the more the public will be educated about international issue, the better we will be in terms of country. And we had a program 10 years ago, public awareness for NGOs. NGOs in Canada has the mandate to educate the population about international poverty issues, and it has been cut. So I think one good investment for our aid effectiveness is certainly to educate the public in general.
Thank you. I'm going to move to the next questioner. So I'm going to start with the second round, and Mr. Miller is going to split his time with Mr. Sani. Mr. Miller.
Bonjour. Merci de voter.
Good afternoon. Thanks for your testimony. I sensed a lot of frustration from you, justified frustration, undoubtedly, because, as you said, the objective should be eliminating extreme poverty. And particularly, Mr. Brown expressed his frustration with the review process. I would say it's probably too early to judge, and we should see what happens in the future, but there has been some consultation, particularly through the committee. But I heard several suggestions, practical suggestions. Now, my father is an academic, so I frequently get frustrated with people who don't provide concrete solutions. So I don't want to target you just because I'm biased in that respect. But I heard you make recommendations about decentralization, specialization. You also spoke a little bit about increasing the funding available for eliminating extreme poverty. And then you also talked about maybe decentralizing diplomacy, so giving a bit more leverage to the diplomats who are already there working on the ground. But can you talk a little bit more about the decision-making process and concrete steps that could be taken after we think about those issues? Like, of course, we're doing our work, but are there countries that are doing things better than we are? Are there situations where we could simply give the funding and wait to see how things play out? Well, I think you need to be realistic, as Mr. O'Day said, about the possible impact that any donor country can have, and the impact that aid can have in general. Even the countries that depend the most on official development assistance may only get an amount equivalent to 10% of their GDP. So you need to be realistic about what aid can actually do and what it can't do. Secondly, I think that where we need to start cleaning things up is here at home. We have a certain amount of influence as a G7 country, an OECD country, and we should continue to try to influence international standards and so on. But if we really want to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of Canadian aid, we would do the things that my colleague Stephen Brown said. So decentralization, looking at getting very deep local expertise. Then there are some administrative reforms that can be made to our public administration and our foreign service. For example, we can stop rotating staff, rotating civil servants so quickly. When I worked in Zimbabwe, I had three different Canadian counterparts in 5 years there. And that was because there was such a fast rate of turnover. And in Zimbabwe, like in other countries, you often need at least a year and a half to really get adapted to the area, to understand the local situation, and so on. And so you might have 1 year where you're really effective, and then you're getting ready to leave at the end of 3 years. So we need to adjust that turnover rate And finally, I think that we need to question some of our working methods within the civil service. And this applies not only to our official development aid program, but to the civil service as a whole. I think the way the Canadian government has been focusing on results lately is not always the best approach for some international projects and Canadian projects. It's good if you want to build a bridge or build an airport. It's a very powerful tool for that type of project. But when you're talking about strengthening capacities, promoting good governance, promoting women's rights, and so on, this tool can complicate things a lot. And as I said earlier, it really pushes civil servants to simply get more creative in the way they write their reports, which is not necessarily a good thing, in my opinion. I think this is a problem that is increasing, and this is the fact that we're putting too much emphasis on empowerment. Or rather, on accountability, I should say. We want to account for every last cent and tracking where it's spent. But the fact is that international development is a very uncertain context. There are going to be projects that fail. There are going to be risks. And there's value in recognizing and studying those risks, not to create a secret report that will never be made public, but to do what other organizations do, like the Department for International Development in the UK. They really have this introspection process, a self-criticism process, where they try to recognize their failures and to draw lessons from that. In Canada, I feel like we're too afraid of saying, oh, well, we wasted money on this. And so we do everything in our power to try to hide the results of failed projects. I think that this idea of the flavor of the month also forces civil servants to present their objectives differently. For example, if they want to build a school in Kenya, they might say, oh, and well, this is the region where there's a significant mining sector, for example, and then that will catch the attention of a former minister who was very interested in that. Even before CEDA merged with DFATE, there was something unveiled by the Globe and Mail, and that was a report about the priority countries, and there was an analysis of those countries, and the question was asked, should we be in those countries? For each country, the Globe presented what was called the bottom line, and often a lot of that text was redacted because the information had been obtained through an access to information request, and not all of it was public. But in most cases, the bottom line came down to Canadian commercial interests, and that was even before the merger. So I fear that the merger it was justified because they were talking about aligning policies, but if we're aligning our policies with Canadian commercial interests, that's bad for development. And this sort of comes back to some of the consultations are going on now, and also the work of the committee. You're talking about development, but you're not talking about the other institutions of the Government of Canada that also have an impact on development. For example, in the countries that were mentioned in the announcement last week, or the priorities that were mentioned last week, you can see human rights, women's rights, and peace and security. And I don't know why we're focusing on those countries, or I don't know how to reconcile that decision when we're talking about those priorities, but then we're sending arms to Saudi Arabia, a country that doesn't respect women's rights or human rights, and it's one of the most authoritarian regimes in the world. So it's one thing to look at what aid can do, but beyond aid, we need to look at the other work of Global Affairs Canada and in even the work of other departments.
I want to been very interesting. I think if we had a couple more hours, we'd probably sit here for a while to talk about this. It's been refreshing to hear the three of you speak about sort of the issues relating to this study. Just to let everyone know, we're just in the process of having a discussion about extending the discussion and the study, simply because we've found that the time that we've allocated is not going to do justice to this study, so we're going to increase the time that we will have. And I want to admit to Mr. Brown and the rest of you that I'm one of those who thinks that these themes are all just basically laid out so you could fit any country into them. So it really is not as important to me, at least as a chair, as it might be to some, simply because, for example, securing the future of children and youth. I could put every country in the world into that category. And so I don't think that's the issue so much as the countries and how we would develop a strategy to get some real results on the ground. And I think you've helped us with that this afternoon and this evening, and I very much appreciate that. So thank you very much for coming, and we hope that we can do this again sometimes. Colleagues, we're going to go into camera just for 5 minutes, so I want to wrap it up because we're online with TV, but then we'll go in camera just for 5 minutes. So I want to adjourn this meeting and then just go right in, suspend, and then just go right into camera.